In this lecture, we're going to continue on recovery strategies and more specifically, disaster recovery sites. Not long ago, we talked about how we had a maximum tolerable downtime for our critical systems. Now we use that to design our mitigation strategies and how we can recover. And one of the things we can do to recover from whatever incident we have could be disaster recovery sites. And they come in a few flavors that I would know for the exam. First off, we have a redundant site, and the name sort of makes sense. It is a site that is identical to our production site. It is completely redundant, it has real-time copies of our data, and it can either be set up to fail over when there is a disaster, something happens, we automatically switch the traffic over to the redundant site, or we can choose to have both sites as an active-active pair. We use load balancing and then we send the traffic both to the primary and the redundant sites. If anything happens to either of them, well then all the traffic just flows to the other site. And since the site is identical, that means that we have exactly the same power requirements, HVAC requirements, we would have raised floors, generators, UPSs, exactly the same hardware specs on everything, it is identical. Now we may choose to only house our critical applications in the redundant site, but in most cases, redundant means identical. And because it is identical, we have two of the same sites, it's also the most expensive type. But on the plus side, if anything happens at either of these sites, our end users, our employees, should never notice. And if we do actually have redundant sites, I have never worked anywhere where we did, but if we do, it is important that they are geographically distant. I have worked in many places where we had multiple data centers. In the last job I had in California, we had 2 data centers, and the primary and secondary data center had different applications, but both of them were within half a mile. Meaning if something bad happens, like an earthquake, this was California, it is most likely it will affect both data centers. So as part of what I did, we started migrating part of the secondary data center about 50 miles away. It's still not a lot, but it is much better. If a disaster struck, it is much less likely to affect both data centers. Alright, now on to hot sites. A hot site is similar to a redundant site, but it only houses our critical applications and systems, and these would most often be on lower spec systems. Remember the minimum operating requirements? This is where we would use those. We have exactly as little hardware spec, HVAC, power, whatever, as we can get away with. It's still a full data center, but the footprint is much smaller. And being a full data center, that means that we have redundant UPSs, redundant HVACs, internet service providers, generators, everything we would have in a regular data center, just much smaller. And with a hot site, we would fail the traffic over manually. This doesn't happen automatically, but it should take an hour or less. And in our hot site, we would be required to have near or real-time copies of the data for those critical systems. If you remember when we talked about backup strategies, and one of those was we sent data to an off-site facility every time there was a change, this is where we would use it. Now the next variety is a warm site. And a warm site is similar to a hot site, but it does not have the real or near real-time data transfer. Warm sites are still smaller but fully spec'd data centers with all the same stuff we would have at a hot site, but we would need to bring the backup tapes to restore the data. Once it is restored, we manually fail the traffic over to the warm site. But the switchover and the restores can take somewhere between 4 and 24 hours, sometimes more. So if for us it is completely unacceptable to be down for 24 hours or more, well then we wouldn't use a warm site. And how long it takes to restore really depends on multiple factors. How much are we restoring? Where do we keep our backups? What happens at the primary site? But it is something we know before the disaster hits. Moving on to cold sites. They are again similar sized, but not a full data center. They have all the same redundant stuff. But the redundant stuff is the data center itself, UPSs, HVACs, internet service providers, generators. What it does not have is hardware. There are no servers. It's just a site that is ready for us to bring hardware to. We then need to go out and get that hardware, we need to configure it, we need to add the applications, we need to restore. Basically, we rebuild everything. And this is obviously the cheapest of the 4, but here recovery can take weeks. I have worked in places where we had hot sites. I have worked in places where we had redundant sites. I don't think I've ever worked anywhere where we had either a warm or a cold site, And I think the major reason here is it is just not cost effective. We're going to be down for a long period of time, and we have to pay for that infrastructure that really just sits there. Another solution that I have also seen is a reciprocal site. Here, our organization have a contract with another organization in the area that we do business in, and we have 1 or 2 racks in their data center with our equipment. It is not connected to anything on the network other than their switches. We have a rack or 2 of their servers in our data center, and they have the same at their site. And it is important here, those 2 racks are completely segmented off from the rest of the network. And the reason they should be in the same line of business is because then they would have the same legal requirements. When I worked at a bank, we had a reciprocal agreement with another bank in another state, and since they have to live up to the same PCI DSS standard and they were compliant, it was okay for us to put our stuff in their data center and vice versa. A reciprocal agreement could also be, if something happens in our data center, is it okay if we bring some stuff to yours? But that is less common. First off, because it's just kind of a promise. Sure, you can put stuff in our data center, but if something happens, we don't have any guarantees. But if we already have a rack or 2 in their data centers that is powered up, ready to go, real-time copies of our data, this is really very similar to a redundant site. With that reciprocal agreement, we obviously only house our critical applications at the other site, but we can, if done right, fail our traffic over and be up within an hour. Then we have mobile sites, and mobile means that they can move. It's basically a data center on wheels. Either it's a container or a trailer that can be moved by a truck. It is spec'd like a full data center, heating, air conditioning, fire suppression, physical security, UPS, and it may also sometimes have a generator. If they're entirely independent, that means that they do. They can also have their own satellite internet, while other times you might need to drive them somewhere and hook them up to power and internet. I personally haven't seen a lot of those around because they're just not cost effective, but I'm sure there are places where they would make sense. Which then brings us to subscription or cloud sites. And they are getting much more prevalent because it's cost effective and it can be very cheap. At least cheap compared to a hot site or a redundant site. And this is just the same as any other cloud service. We pay someone else to either have servers that are spec'd to a minimum operating requirements or a full replica of our entire production environment. How much we want really depends on what we need, what is important. And the cloud provider will then have an agreement that says within X amount of hours, this has to be up and running. They either have their systems built already and spun up, or they have them built and powered down, and the second we tell them we need them up and running, they power the systems, apply the latest backups, and we should be up and running. Now, how fast that is really depends on how much we pay and the system specs. And this is again one of those places where exactly enough, no more, no less. In some places you might pay very little because the systems are just stored there, they're using disk space, but they're spun down, meaning they're not using memory or CPU. In other places, you might choose to say, I want the full spec system up and running at all times, and then obviously you pay more. Whereas the places where the systems are powered down, they are inexpensive until something happens. It might be a few $1,000s a month just having the system sit there and do nothing, but then when you need them up, they power the systems on, they start using CPU and memory, then you might pay $50,000 a month. It is cheaper until something happens. Whatever solution we choose the one that makes sense for our business based on our requirements. And with that, we are done with disaster recovery sites. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next lecture.